So if you've been a viewer of some of my other videos, you know that I spend a fair amount of time talking about people's exits from companies, whether it be a layoff, a firing, or, in the case of today's video, a performance improvement plan, otherwise known as a PIP. And I've done a few videos on these, but this is another story from one of my viewers. And as he sent me an email and asked me my opinion on the situation and what my advice was, and I was happy to give it to him. But as I read through the email, the sense of dread that I had for this person just kept going higher and higher and higher with each line that I read. So I'm going to break down the story for you, talk about some red flags along the way, and then give you some advice on if you find yourself in a similar situation, what you can do about it. So Tim is 61 years old, and he is a member of his organizations, and he works for a very large organization. I would say probably in excess of 10 to 20,000 people, right? I believe it's a multinational organization. And quite frankly, they should know better than to do what they did. But I digress. We'll get to that in a second. But he's a 61-year-old Caucasian male, and he's also a member of his company's business resource group, or affinity groups as sometimes they're called, and it's the LGBT affinity group. And now, I don't know if this individual is gay or straight. He could be an ally, but he called out that he was over the age of 60, plus he was a member of this group. And I think what he's doing is trying to figure out if those were common denominators that led to what happened to him. So keep that in mind as we navigate this story. So imagine yourself, first of all, you're stressed out, right? You've been placed on a PIP about 21 days ago. You've worked with your manager, and you probably put yourself in, as Tim did in this story. He put himself in the mindset of, I'm going to amp up my performance. I'm going to take this PIP as a roadmap to future success. And that's what he set out to do. So for 3 weeks, he threw himself into it. And then his boss said, hey, I'm scheduling a meeting for us, kind of a check-in. Now, if this is a 90-day PIP, which is pretty standard, then having regular intervals of check-in throughout the way, on its face is a good indicator of a good manager, right? They're trying to be supportive and check in to say, hey, you're on the right path, or no, you're not. As I read that, I was like, okay, 21-day PIP check-in, that makes sense. So the manager asked that Tim compile a PowerPoint presentation to kind of go over and take him through the progress to date. All makes sense. I think the PowerPoint's a little bit over the top. We could have just had a conversation, but okay, he wants PowerPoint. Some people in corporate America cannot communicate without a 300-page PowerPoint deck. So maybe his manager is one of them. So Tim gets into the room and he's setting everything up, making sure the AV is working, all the things. And then his boss sits down without HR present, no warning. Oh, by the way, security's outside the door. We know where this story is going, right? He doesn't even let Tim continue with the presentation or even start the presentation, and separates Tim's employment from the organization. And I hope you're as outraged watching this as I am, because this is where I just felt like it was a gut punch. What a bait and switch that his manager did to him. Made him do all this busy work for probably 3 weeks, right? He's like spinning his wheels, trying to do the best he could, then has to do this busy work to put a presentation together, only to find out that was all for naught. Now he's terminated from the organization. It's no wonder so many of you who comment on my videos have such a disdain, a loathing for corporate America and management, and even HR. By the way, HR was not present in this story, but we will get to that. I agree with you in this case. This is a absolute breakdown and epic failure on the part of management, and does lead you to conclude that this was the plan all along. Oh, by the way, did I mention? Tim is 4 months away from being fully vested in his retirement, his pension, his 401k, perhaps any stock options. I don't know what else he's got in his portfolio, but he is 4 months away at this point. This could have been handled so much better, and it informed a smooth exit if in fact that, they wanted Tim out of the workplace. They could have made it wildly easier, wildly less impactful on Tim, and gotten what they wanted, maybe for a little money, maybe, but we'll get to that in a second. So Tim reached out to me after all of this happened. And, can you imagine, not only is it shocking, but then it's exacerbated by the fact that there's security hanging outside the door. I had security outside the door when I've conducted separations? Absolutely. But it's usually been under the premise that we were thinking that this person could become violent or things could get dramatic. And it was for our safety. It's yet one more thing that is a bit dehumanizing for Tim. Now, I'm going to assume, I don't know this, but I bet that after the decision was delivered to Tim, that security escorted him to his desk, packed up his things, and escorted him to the door. I've seen that movie before, and it is awful. Now, have I worked with managers to separate an employee before the original time frame of the PIP? Sure. If we've implemented a PIP and at day 60 of a 90-day PIP, we see no progress, the employee has just given up. And at that point, 60 days is a reasonable amount of time to make some sort of progress on what's laid out in the PIP. So, which would inform that we could say, okay, we gave them enough opportunity. They're not doing anything. We're going to just, end it now. That makes sense to me. But 90 days and then a check-in at 21 days, that's barely any time to kind of put stuff into play and then actually show some substantive results. So to me, they were just absolutely trying to put a paper trail together to inform the decision that had been made before they even put him on a PIP. And now, as we'll talk about in a second, again, I'm not a lawyer, but in my humble opinion, that manager has placed the company at risk of a lawsuit. What's the first red flag I see here is that HR is not even in the equation. And I'm going to assume that the company Tim works for is very similar to companies I've worked for, large corporations with probably a substantial HR department. And this manager most likely has an HR business partner. A couple things could be at play here. HR could have said, okay, manager, you're going to put your employee on a PIP. Here's the form. Go forth and conquer. I've seen that before. It's not great because I do think there needs to be some consultative support between the HR person and the manager to make sure that PIP is actually a smart goal, right? Do I think the HR person needs to be present for all the check-ins with the PIP? It depends on the scenario. To have them totally absent from the equation, I think, is a huge red flag. If you do not see your HR representative present, or at least know that they were consulted in this equation, you might ask that or go follow up with them later and say, hey, my boss just put me on a PIP. Where were you? What do you think? That type of stuff. So, and to say nothing of, if you're going to terminate somebody, that warrants putting a security guard outside the conference room. You should have HR there to begin with. So this manager didn't bother. They didn't have HR present. They just defaulted to calling security. And poor Tim walks in thinking he's going to give a presentation, get some momentum coming out of this meeting, and he gets fired instead. A 90-day PIP and then check termination at 21, unless there's egregious misconduct, I would highly, as an HR person, would recommend against that. I would say to that manager, you're not giving Tim enough time to actually achieve some results that he can then present to you. And you can say, hey, this person's engaged. They're on the right track. I want to help support them. Or they're not on the right track. And this is kind of going in a different direction. It seems like I'm reading between the lines. This is a manager that went a bit rogue and is like, look, I want Tim gone. And see, here's the other problem. They're kind of couching this in that it's Tim's performance, but Tim is looking at this through a different lens. Hey, why am I being targeted? Is it because of my age? And I think I need to do another video on ageism in the workplace and age discrimination. So stay tuned for that. Or is it my involvement with this business resource group, the LGBTQ business resource group, right? Could that be another perhaps bias that my manager now has against me, and he's hiding behind this PIP as a way to discriminate against me and get me out of the organization? Those are all valid concerns. And absent any other information, Tim's left to question the real reasons for how all of this went down. If I was advising this manager, like, look, you want Tim gone. Okay, I get that, you've made the decision. Here's a better way to do it. Let's put a severance package in place that bridges Tim from now until he vests, and then he can go off on his own. Tim signs a document. He's not going to sue us, and everybody's happy. But no, you had to do this whole smoke and mirrors, dog and pony show. And now you've put the organization at a risk of a lawsuit. And that's kind of where we're headed right here, because I personally, in my non-lawyer, again, not a lawyer, non-lawyerly mind, think that Tim does have a cause to pursue this further, to get the advice of an employment attorney, to seek out the EEOC. And we'll talk through those steps in just a minute. But we could have avoided that. We didn't have to be here. And yet here we are. Behavior like this doesn't just impact Tim, right? It speaks to the broader culture, because there's lots of people watching this go down, right? Somebody who's being performance managed or getting terminated are, sometimes they're the worst kept secrets, right? So people know what's going on. So Tim may have openly shared, hey, I've got to check in with my manager today, any advice for me? And then that gets around. So now they see not only Tim going in there for that check-in, but then they see security at the door. Then they see Tim packing his stuff. And they know that he wasn't given ample opportunity to change. So what does that say to the rest of the people that, you're next? That's what I would assume. And that could inform attrition of actually good people from the organization, and informs a low trust environment. Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry, I forgot. We're going to go back for a second. The other thing they did was they scheduled this meeting on the 30th of July. If they had scheduled it on August 1st, Tim would have been able to leverage all of his benefits, medical, all those things, through the end of August. But by doing it at the 30th of July, he's literally stripped of not only his income, but his medical benefits. And many people don't realize that, right? That, if we get to the first of a new month, your benefits, no matter when you separate in that month, will be valid for the rest of that month. So I think it was cold and calculated. They wanted him gone. And maybe this is a way that they thought, hey, we're going to get back at him. See, again, absent any other information, we're just looking at the behavior, and we're left to conclude it's because of these other reasons. First thing to do, you've got to start filing for unemployment immediately. Keep your basic needs met, right? Because if those are met, then your mind has the ability to focus on other things. If you have the ability to refill your prescriptions, I told Tim, I was like, dude, you got to do it today. The other thing too, and I told Tim, this could be a bit of saber rattling that you're requesting your employee file from HR. You absolutely have every right to see that and request it, and they have to provide it to you. Have the file, but then couple it with a timeline of who, what, where, when, how, of how all of this stuff went down. And then the other thing I would say is start reaching out for legal advice, right? I've talked about this before. You have an employee assistance program. Some of those programs may offer some referrals to an employment attorney. And I know some of you have argued with me in the comments. They're like, Rob, EAP they're going to report right back to the company. No, they're not. They're a third party. They're bound by confidentiality. Look up HIPAA, as is the providers they work with. So if it's a medical professional or a mental health professional, they are bound by the statutes in HIPAA or what have you. So they are not going to report back to the company. If you think they are, I can't change your mind. But my experience has been that they are not going to report back to the company. But they could make referrals to an employment attorney or what have you. Or then just start Googling or asking trusted people in your life, hey, do you know of a good attorney? Even if it's an attorney that may not practice employment law, maybe that person could refer you to somebody in their network. Be careful when you're selecting an attorney, and try to do as much due diligence as you can, because you want to get the right support for your situation. Okay, so let's talk about the EEOC for a minute, and that's the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission from the federal government. Their scope of reference is on these different categories. So, things like age, race, sex, national origin. That's what they focus on. So what'll happen is you try to get an appointment with them, right? So gather your documentation. And I will say, I found it here in Washington, I found it quite arduous. First, there was some, you'd go on their website, fill out all the forms, and then for the next 3 months, there's no appointments available. Okay, that's a little demoralizing. And then suddenly it go, we had one open up and now you have one 2 months from now. So I'm just keeping it real. It is not a quick process. So you finally get to tell your story to somebody who's basically, an investigator. And I'm just going to use my case as a frame of reference. Was I told them my story and they said, hey, at the end of the day, what the behavior you're describing only impacts you, allegedly. And we're basically focused on something that happens to a large group of people. And think class action, that type of stuff. So in short, what they're saying is we as the EEOC are not going to take this case on, but we've looked into your matter and now, or we've heard your matter rather, and now we're going to issue you what's called a right to sue letter, which then you can go bring to an employment attorney and say, hey, I went to the EEOC. They're not willing to take this case, but they did give me the right to sue letter. How can we proceed forward from here? I personally would work those two paths in tandem, right? Say, go seek out an employment attorney, get on their radar, have a conversation, also file with the EEOC or your state equivalent and get that paperwork going. So when you're talking to the employment attorney, you can basically say, hey, I've already filed over here and I'm kind of waiting for my appointment, but that's why I'm talking to you to keep things moving at the same time and see where that goes. But I would say it's going to take some resilience here. And quite frankly, I gave up. I gave up on my charge. I was like, you know what? For me personally, and again, I'm just speaking from my own experience, I found that I was being consumed by anger, resentment, and all that type of stuff. And I was not liking the person it was turning me into because I was hyper focused on I've been wronged and all those types of things. So I just finally let it go. I wasn't in the same situation Tim was in, that I had, there were financial implications potentially, right? With him and his pension, I think that ups the ante here, right? So for me, it was a totally different situation. And I just was like, I can't anymore. I need to focus on something positive. And that's what I did. For Tim, I think there's a lot more, quite frankly, at stake. Now, what will happen is companies don't want this to go to court, right? You're saying, Rob, it's going to cost so much money to get an attorney and blah, 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 all the things. Yes, I agree with you. Also, companies don't want to go to court. What they will do is they'll get a demand letter from that attorney you're working with and they'll negotiate back and forth. What I would argue here is be careful of the details, because that lawyer is, if they don't take just a flat fee, if they take a percent, make sure that percent is tied to, say, a cash payout. And in Tim's case, not tied to a percent of his retirement income. That's an important detail that you could easily overlook. Make sure you know what you're signing up for with that attorney. I'm not saying they're trying to pull one over on you, but they're gonna look to bill as much an hour or get as big a piece of that pie as they can. They're going to send a demand letter. Again, it goes back and forth, and you'll end up with a settlement because nobody wants to go before a judge, especially the company, right? Because that's actually going to cost more money for the company in time and legal counsel, sometimes getting external legal counsel. It costs them more money to do all that than just to write you a check. So really keep that in mind. That is likely, in my humble opinion, where this will end up. You heard me mention a minute ago that I was consumed with anger, resentment. I will add on to that. It was depression, all of those types of things. Even though I wasn't actually fired in my equation, but I didn't like the person it was making me become. I would have benefited from talking to some sort of a counselor, a psychologist, or what have you. If you feel like you're in that boat, I highly recommend. And maybe you can, if EAP is still available to you, Tim, as an example, before it got cut off, that he could leverage EAP to get a referral out to a psychologist. Sometimes you get in your head and what's in your head is a very dark place and not always representative of reality. So it's helpful to talk to somebody who isn't just going to validate your own stance. They're going to actually challenge you and help you to kind of get out of that dark space. A lot of people say, well, how can I prepare myself or protect myself in the workplace from getting ambushed like Tim or, treated like that other person? I'll link her video here about how she got told she was excellent, but then put on a performance plan. And none of that makes sense. I'm still baffled by that whole situation. How are you communicating with your manager, right, on your progress? It may mean over communicating, right? So you always know that you're on the same page with your manager. Is that a fail-safe? Absolutely not. I mean, there could still be a manager who wants you gone for whatever reason. The more you're on the same page with them and lockstep with them on your performance and your results and your deliverables, the better off you'll be. And then obviously keep an updated resume. I mean, all of us let that, everything's going great. I don't feel like dealing with my resume, right? It's not a bad idea to keep that resume current, keep your LinkedIn profile current. If there are people, recruiters cold calling you for interviews, and even if you're happy, what's the harm? Take the interview, have a conversation. People talk a lot on my channel in the comments about companies aren't loyal, loyalty is only a one-way street. I can't argue with that. I do still think that doing a good job and being loyal to a company does have some benefits to a degree. And that's why you should always be open to these other, opportunities if they come your way in the form of an interview or just a conversation with somebody in your network. Understand your rights, right? We get those employee handbooks on day one, and now we're supposed to electronically sign that we've received it. And now we're held to that. But let's be real. Do you read that thing from cover to cover? I didn't. And I was in HR. I wrote it. Maybe Tim in this situation can say, hey, I've read the handbook, and for people being performance managed, it could be separation at 60 days. Why are we talking about this at 21 days? Trust your instincts. If you have this gnawing voice inside you, this kind of pit in your gut, that might be telling you that something's off, and kind of maybe seek out some trusted advisors on, and some counsel from them on what they think of the situation, right? It's always helpful for us to, hey, am I crazy, or what are you seeing about this, right? So again, it should be trusted advisors, not somebody just, Bill next to you in the cube saying, hey, Bill, what do you think? Don't trust Bill. Bill might have a very big mouth and tell anybody who will listen that you are, questioning, what's going on with respect to your performance. So make sure the person you're talking to is somebody you trust and admire, maybe inside or outside the organization. Tim's story is not unique. My intent in making videos like this is so that you can prepare yourself. You're armed with some information on how to react. So when you are blindsided, you can take a beat and say, okay, I think I know what to do, or at least a place to start. So that's my intent here. PIPs should always be, again, performance improvement plans should always be fair and transparent. That's why I said, HR being out of the equation in this situation really is an indicator to me that this was not fair from the onset. If HR is not visibly part of the conversation, go ask them, see what they say, see if they're even aware of what's going on, and then go from there. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Tim, I wish you well. I do not envy the position you're in, and I'm so sorry, and I'm sure people watching this are equally as sorry that you had to go through that. You got ambushed and you got fired and all the type of stuff. But stay strong. I hope you're well. I do think you have cause to go speak to an attorney and seek outside counsel. So please, I hope you're doing that now. But take care of your basic needs so you can kind of manage this other stuff, and make sure you've applied for unemployment benefits. And until next time, my name is Rob, and if you like content like this, if you find it helpful, I'd be absolutely honored if you would like and subscribe to this channel. I will continue to make some more videos, some of that are coming up in the future. I've got one I'm working on about a workplace Karen. I love a good Karen video. And then I mentioned one before. I'm going to do one about ageism in the workplace, and other ones. If you've got some things you'd like me to talk about, drop them in the comments below. Maybe I'll stick it on a future episode. So until next time, I hope you're well, and take care. This video is recorded and produced by Just Talk Studios, the premier video podcasting studio in Bellevue, Washington. Visit justtalkstudios.com to learn more and book your session today.